When God, before he made his covenant with Abraham, he was making, first of all, he required that he was going to leave his country and his kindred. But then he continued on that he made a promise to Abram at the time, that he was going to bless him and his seed. He was going to fulfill this promise and the need that Abraham had for a seed and an offspring. On the other hand, Abram felt the desire God had to dwell with man as in the beginning with Adam. It was the consequences of broken commitment in the Garden of Eden that was caused the separation between God and man. But it was God's eternal desire for man to dwell with God always. In Genesis chapter 17, verse number 7, it reads, "I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you." You see, God intended for this covenant to be an everlasting covenant. When God makes a covenant, not only does he speak his covenant, but he ratifies his covenant and he seals his covenant. He instructed Abraham at the time, to circumcise all the male children and the servants. And this covenant required three things. First of all, it required a cutting away. The first cutting away that was required is he had to cut away his old life. As we mentioned before, he had to leave his country and his kindred and go to a place that God would show him. The next thing that was a cutting away of was of the flesh or the foreskin. Now, what this resulted in, that there was a shedding of blood. When there was a shedding of blood, this was a sign of a true commitment, a sign of a sacrifice that man would make, that Abraham would make, and his kindred to stay in covenant with God. The next thing that happened is there was an adoption that took place, for God would make Israel his children. And Abraham, guess what? He had a new name, from Abram to Abraham. Now this covenant would continue to man through a man by the name of Jacob. Jacob had a new name when he had his covenant with God, and his name was changed to Israel. God would then ratify this covenant through Moses. And when he ratified this covenant through Moses, he wrote by his own hand on tablets of clay. But he didn't stop there. He ratified this covenant, writing on the clay tablets, and God would make his desire known specifically by calling this the law. Now here it was. They were beginning to follow after the law and the covenant. But what the problem is with this covenant is they got so tied to the law and the specifics that they did not enter into relationship with God. That's what God's desire was in the first place, was relationship. What we must be careful to do is not get so busy in the particulars that we forget about the relationship that we desired in the first place. Now, what this does is it shows a pattern for marital covenant.
And let's talk about the marital covenant. First of all, it starts with a promise or commitment. When we talk about commitment, we're talking about the intention to keep a promise. Now, the difference here is that God is infallible, and he cannot break his promise, and whatever he intends to do, it will come to pass. But how many know, with our brothers and sisters, our friends, and what have you, we typically break promises, don't we? Therefore, marriage calls for a different type of commitment or marriage covenant. Now, to establish a marital covenant in line with God's covenant, we are required to do the following. We need to first cut out our old life. In Genesis 2:23, it says, "Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be" what? One flesh. We can't live as if we are single anymore. We have to realize that we are no longer attached to our family, but that we have a new family with our spouse. The other thing that we're required to do is the shedding of blood. When a husband consummates the marriage covenant with his wife, as this is intended to be their first act of intimacy, there will be a sign of blood at the tearing away of the flesh. And then finally, there is taking of a new name. You have a new name.
So as we wrap this up, where do we go from this covenant, understanding what God meant as an everlasting covenant? What brought us to this point? First of all, Israel had broken their promise and their commitment with God. They were not faithful to God. They didn't keep their promises. But guess what? In spite of that, God still kept his promise. God's everlasting covenant would remain. He would not allow their stopping from keeping their covenant to change him to a place where he would not keep his covenant. In other words, God did not allow their lack of commitment to change his commitment. And so what we must do if we want our marriage to last forever is that even if our spouse, even if they are having a bad time in their life and a difficult time in their life, and even if they decide not to keep their covenant, that does not exonerate us from keeping the covenant that we have with God and our covenant that we have to him. The covenant is what makes it last forever. God had intended from the very beginning to do whatever it takes to make his covenant stick. Somebody say, you got to do whatever it takes. So in this new covenant, and as we get to our text in the last few minutes, is that God said in his word to Jeremiah, the prophet, he said, these days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make my new covenant with the people of Israel and the people of God. You see, at this point, Israel they were in turmoil because they knew that they had not kept their commitment with God. They knew that there were repercussions from them not following their commitment with God. And so they were in a place where they were wondering, are we still going to be the children of God forever? Or does this mean the end of our relationship? But what they did not realize is our God is an everlasting God. And that there is nothing that we can do to keep God from being God. So if God's word is true, guess what? It's going to come to pass. If God says that we are his children, guess what? We are his children. If God promised to love us through Jesus Christ, guess what? He followed that commitment all the way to the cross. God was willing to do whatever it took to make sure that the commitment was kept. And so in the second part of this, in verse number 33, he begins to say, this is the covenant that I will make with my people of Israel after time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it in their hearts. I will be their God and they will be my people. So let's compare the old covenant with the new covenant. In the old covenant, there was written on tablets of stone, and it was called the law. This represented the flesh. But in the new covenant, it is written in their minds and in their hearts. In other words, it is the Holy Spirit that places it in our hearts and in our conscience, in our minds, that you cannot be the way you used to be. But when you entered into a covenant with God, that you are a new creation. All things are passed away, and behold, all things are made new. In the old covenant, it was according to the flesh. That's how they walked after. It was after however they felt for the day. But in the new covenant, they walked after the Spirit. For if we are the children of God, we no longer attend to the things of the flesh, but we follow after the Spirit. In the old covenant, there was a circumcision of the flesh. But in the new covenant, it was a circumcision of the heart. In the old covenant, it was a partial death. But in the new covenant, it was the death of the body of Jesus Christ. In the old covenant, it was based on the law, thou and thou shalt not. But in the new covenant, it's based on relationship. So as we bring this to a close, what makes it a difference between the marriage that lasts and the marriage that lasts forever? In the marriage that lasts, our vows are written on our vows and our license. But in a marriage that lasts forever, it's engraved in our heart. In a marriage that lasts, is according to the flesh. It's what we feel, it's what we see. But in the new marriage that lasts forever, guess what? It's according to the Spirit that lies in us. In the marriage that lasts, it is a partial commitment. But in a new marriage, the marriage that lasts forever, it's a death of singleness to become one with each other. In the old covenant, it was one that just required part commitment. But in the new covenant, in the new marriage that lasts forever, it is a commitment that takes all of us. So as we're here, what we want you to understand is that A marriage that lasts forever is one that's possible. But it's only possible if we no longer resort to who we used to be. If we no longer resort to what our flesh wants to do. But when it gets really hard and when, it takes the Spirit of God to forgive the unforgivable. There's times when I know that I've been unforgivable. It takes the Spirit of God for us to love someone that at times when they're sick, they cannot love us back. But guess what? Through the Spirit of God, we can love eternally. And so what we have to do is when we want a love that lasts forever, we got to choose a God that lasts forever. It doesn't just begin when we get married, but in our relationship with God. If you're single, guess what? Your covenant is with God. You are married to Him. That there is no one that can tear you apart from loving your God. That no matter if you can see Him or if you don't see Him, you know that His love is for real. That no matter if you think that things are going your way, it's according to the will of God. God, I seek to love you. God, I seek to worship you. God, I just want to be in your presence. I don't care what it takes, oh God. God, I just want to be with you. God, just to see you as you are. God, just to be one with you and be with you and just as you are. Jesus Christ, make me a new creation. God, I cannot continue in the way that I have been, but God, I need your Spirit. God, I need your Spirit to make me alive. God, I need your Spirit to make us whole again. That's how we make our love last forever. So what we invite you to do today is we invite you to make that covenant commitment with God first. We invite you to make that covenant commitment with each other. I remember before I asked Kristen to marry me, I prayed. I said, God, this is a woman that I want to marry. But Lord, I want to know that it's in your will. I want to know that we're remaining in covenant with you, God. First, God was silent. I said, Lord, I need to hear from you. I asked him again, I said, God, this is the woman that I want to marry. But God, will you bless us? He was silent. And finally, I asked the third time, I said, God, I got to know that this covenant commitment will last forever. And he said, are you willing to do whatever it takes? The reason why our covenant commitment is strong now is because our covenant commitment started with God. Will you start yours with God today? If you don't know who God is, come down and give your life to Him. If you want